raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together right here in our favorite corner of the Cross-Tyme Pub, probing history's mysteries and scouring the world's ancient sources of knowledge as we pursue precious secrets of the ancient past. And of course, as always, glad to be here with you guys. Joining me in the studio, the gentlemen, the lads of the ancient times, Mr. James Waldo, geologist extraordinaire, and Jason Pentrail. Jason, sir, my friend, how are you?
I am well, indeed. Lots of great things going on. I got lots of news from the world of archaeology and, big changes in life. I'm getting my paperwork and everything filed for retirement from my current job. So I'm looking very much forward to that part of life. We'll continue to work, of course, but looking good for the beginning of next year. So very, very happy about that.
James, does this mean you and I get to retire as well?
Good eve. Yeah, I think so. I've already retired once. An exciting thing to be able to do. So I highly recommend it if you can.
Yeah, I'm working on that. I'm a few years behind you fellas. Neither of y'all look retirement age. I had to retire temporarily this morning, though, because, the wind here in Appalachia knocked out the power. And the funny thing is it was already scheduled to be a planned service outage because for the last few days, all my audio work has been very difficult. The nice guys at the phone company have been coming through the neighborhood installing new telephone poles. I had a big interview the other day, and there was a chainsaw coming from that end of the studio. Over on this side, there was a motor drumming. I was able to kind of work the microphone and eliminate most of that, but then when they decided to come right up front with some kind of a wood chipper and park right there in front of my house and run the wood chipper, that made things really difficult. So, yeah, I had to concede, go back, and edit. Yeah, so this morning I thought things couldn't get any worse, and I was already prepared for the power. Well, the power wasn't going out. It was just going to be the service, right? It was going to be a service outage while they were doing maintenance. But then the wind came through, knocked down trees. The power was out for hours, and they ended up canceling the service because they had to try and get the power on. Anyway, I won't belabor the point. So, on to the world of archaeology. We go back in time, and one of the things we love about it, guys, is back then they didn't have power. They didn't have internet. You lived and you died by the stone, unless, of course, the stone was coming from the sky, and that surely meant you were going to die if you were in that path. Jason, have you got an update for us on comets and ancient impacts?
There's a great news story that was forwarded to us from our friend Christopher Moore, and it's called Prehistoric Comet Blast Help Date Stone Artifacts. So I've seen this one going around, really interesting new take on a lot of the stories that we've covered here on the past, but it says new research details how a prehistoric cosmic airburst is assisting archaeologists today. A fragmented comet thought to have smashed into the Earth's atmosphere almost 13 millennia ago, has been credited with far-reaching effects. These include widespread burning across the globe, followed by an impact winter and an anomalous abrupt cooling of the Earth. It also led to the extinction of megafauna such as mammoths and saber-toothed cats, the disappearance of the Clovis culture of the Americas, and the earliest transition to agriculture in the Levant. Okay, so before I move forward, much of this has been covered on the Seven Ages Audio Journal in the past. Just to kind of clean up the narrative here a little bit, as we know, it didn't completely eradicate the Clovis culture. It did probably make life in certain regions much more difficult for them, but it did obviously have a big impact. But getting back to the article itself, scientists have now found another effect of this prehistoric event. It can help archaeologists date stone artifacts. According to a paper in the Journal of Scientific Reports, evidence of the impact, particularly in high concentrations of platinum and of iron-rich microspherules, can serve as stratigraphic yardstick to help establish the age of artifacts and the layers of sediment where they are found, and, importantly, correlate the ages of artifacts and sediments across dig sites in the same area. Now, such has been the case in Wakulla Springs in northern Florida. You will remember a couple years ago, we had a really good episode about this particular site and some of the anomalies that you find there. A high-volume freshwater system known to have hosted people and animals throughout the millennia, but because of the mobile sandy soils and continuous occupation, the sediments have also been subject to mixing that can make it difficult to accurately determine the age of artifacts that are found in and around Wakulla Springs. Quote, there's a fair amount of reworking and virtually no carbon preserved in the sediments, so virtually no radiocarbon dating, says James Kennett, professor emeritus at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who co-authored this new paper. Quote, even though archaeologists have discovered points and tools preserved in general sequence, they didn't know much about their age because they couldn't employ radiocarbon dating. Enter the Younger Dryas boundary, or YDB layer. Characterized by materials that form in extremely high temperatures, greater than 2,000 degrees Celsius, the YDB strewn field has been found to be widely distributed around the globe, including the Americas, Western Europe, and the Middle East. As the comet fragments collided with the Earth's atmosphere close to 12,800 years ago, according to the YDB hypothesis, the heat and pressure comparable to the energy released by thousands of atomic bombs melted metals and minerals and introduced rare elements into the sediment. In finding this layer of material, the researchers say it becomes possible to more accurately estimate the age of the artifacts and the sediments around it. Quote, the Florida sites have a certain archaeological sequence of stone tools with only generally known cultural ages, Kennett says. The idea was to try to see if we could use the 12,800-year-old Younger Dryas boundary to more clearly define the cultural ages and the sequences represented at those sites. The researchers used several methods to characterize the sediments in columns taken from 7 sites in the area, including platinum geochemistry, optically stimulated luminescence, or what's called OSL dating, and the dating of the stone artifacts themselves. OSL is a widely used method for dating archaeological samples in the absence of carbon. It relies on the buildup of absorbed energy in the common minerals such as feldspar and quartz. Quote, basically, there's normal radioactive radiation from these minerals, Kennett says, and what happens is that there's radiation accumulates. But when these minerals are exposed to sunlight, this energy is released. You can use that process to generally date the minerals to the last time they saw the sun. Though a valuable technique, according to the paper, the OSL dates have high uncertainties, typically ranging from about 1,000 to 2,000 years, making for low precision and accuracy for the age depths models that are produced using OSL alone. However, roughly a meter or 3 feet below the surface at each one of these sites that were studied, the researchers found iron-rich microspherules, which would have formed when rock and mineral melted into tiny droplets and cooled after the collision with the comet. They also found unusually high concentrations of platinum, which would have been introduced by cosmic impact. Geochemistry and scanning electron microscopy confirmed these things to be impact-related and thus indicated a clear presence of the YDB layer. Quote, this is critical because the layer containing platinum and microspherules is well dated to 12,800 years ago at many other sites, Kennett says. Therefore, it provides a very useful age level for correlation and dating between the sequences at Wakulla. Between the OSL date, the YDB layer, and the presence of artifacts, the researchers were able to gauge the relative ages of the stone tools found before and after the YDB event, which could allow for sorting into Clovis, pre-Clovis, and post-Clovis ages. Importantly, they were also able for the first time to correlate across the individual sequences, creating for each site a more comprehensive paleo history of the area. So big things happening down in Wakulla Springs. That's a fascinating archaeological site in itself. I certainly encourage everyone to check out all of the papers out there on that site if you haven't, and check out one of our earlier episodes. It was really in-depth. Andy Hemmings was our guest on that one, and we really got into a lot of the details of this site. But again, this research continues to push forward, and I think this is a pretty exciting addition to that research.
Yeah, certainly is. It's always good to see what's happening on that front. Now, if we go a little further back in time, by not too much, maybe to 12,940 BP, we have a very unique artifact that's been discovered out there in Wyoming by the team working with Todd Suravel, and this at the La Prairie Mammoth site near Converse County, Wyoming. Just a quick update on this, which I found to be fascinating. Todd and the team have found a small incised artifact that appears to be a bead. Now, for many who have volunteered on dig sites, especially those from far more recent history, it's not uncommon to find beads at archaeological sites in the western United States. But to find one in situ alongside cultural remains dating back to 12,940 years BP, now that's quite remarkable, because what this seems to be is the earliest instance of a bead that has ever been discovered in really the Western Hemisphere, and to my knowledge, anywhere in the Americas. So there's a new paper about this that was published in Scientific Reports, Use of Hair Bone for the Manufacture of a Clovis Bead. We've had a lot of firsts in the study of the enigmatic ancient technocultural complex known as the Clovis, and now we may have the earliest known use of a bead in American history right there in Wyoming. Pretty fascinating stuff. Smaller scale discovery, but sometimes those little ones are the ones that really count, so kudos to the folks out there in Wyoming for this discovery. Amazing stuff. Now, there was another really interesting discovery I want to touch on before we get to our interview this week, and that, of course, was one that was made beneath the Baltic Sea. It was about 970 meters long. No, it isn't a sunken city, but it definitely is a structure made by human hands. James, you want to fill us in on this one?
Yeah, certainly. And, this is somewhat tangentially connected to the previous two stories, but let's get into it. Geologists have discovered a 970-meter-long megastructure of stone located at a depth of 21 meters on the seabed of the Mecklenburg Bight in the Baltic Sea. The megastructure consists of approximately 1,500 stones and large boulders, which was constructed around 11,000 years ago during the early Mesolithic period. According to a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the megastructure was built by Stone Age hunter-gatherers for hunting herds of the Eurasian reindeer, which migrated seasonally through the sparsely vegetated post-glacial landscape. Similar constructions, which are known as drive lanes, are used for manipulating the movement direction of the animals so that they can be easily trapped in a bottleneck and killed. In the example at Mecklenburg Bight, this bottleneck would be between the adjacent lakeshore and the wall, or even into the lake. Marcel Brotmoller from the University of Rostock said, excluding natural processes and a modern origin, the stone wall could only have been formed after the end of the last ice age, when the landscape was not yet flooded by the Baltic Sea. At this time, the entire population across northern Europe was likely below 5,000 people. One of their main food sources were herds of reindeer, which migrated seasonally through the sparsely vegetated post-glacial landscape, said Brotmoller. According to the researchers, the discovery holds immense scientific significance, being not only the oldest known human structure found in the Baltic Sea, but also for providing new insights into the subsistence patterns of early hunter-gatherer communities. A further study of the stone wall in the seabed will involve using side-scan sonar, sediment echo sounder, and multi-beam echo sounder devices. In addition, underwater archaeologists from the University of Rostock are scheduled to explore the stone wall and its environs in search of archaeological artifacts that could aid in further understanding the structure's significance. So, very interesting story. What do you think, gentlemen?
Well, I had to kind of chuckle a little bit, because naturally you find these structures that were once made where land was, and as sea levels rose, of course, they are subsumed. But it really does show how much the Earth changes over time, and to find a structure like this in one of these areas, the two dimensions that are interesting to me are not only Earth changes that occur over time, but also how underwater archaeology continues to show us incredible things about the ancient past with this massive structure, and indeed a very ancient one.
And I think a thing that's important to understand is, we talk a lot about the Younger Dryas, and, a lot of people discuss that. And we talk about the fact that sea levels at the time were 400 feet lower than they are now, and they've risen essentially to their present day levels. And it seems like it happened overnight, but it really didn't. It took a long time for those sea levels to slowly creep up, hundreds of human generations. So I'm sure the people at the time were maybe somewhat perplexed why the water just keeps coming up and coming up. But it was, probably only a few inches a year, and they could build this big thing, and it was, very useful for a long time, I'm sure. But now it's, 20 meters or 21 meters under the sea surface.
Yeah. Incredible perspectives of the past, and you have to know where to look to be able to find those, huh? I'll tell you something incredible that you can find if you know where to look, and that is the additional content Jason manages for us over there on the Patreon page. My good man, would you like to fill us in on what's been happening lately?
Well, we've been adding more content. We've got several podcasts going on over there simultaneously, and we try to keep those updated on a regular basis for you. We just released a brand new Cross-Tyme Pub last night, so that is up and running. I believe it was episode 37 of that particular podcast, as well as the Digging Deeper, the Green Dragon Book Club. Of course, we'll be recording a new one of those coming up here in the next week or two, so lots of great content. We still have people coming in, signing up, so we certainly appreciate all the support. And if you are interested in getting the additional content for 7Ages Audio Journal, just head over to Patreon, type in the name of the show, 7Ages Audio Journal. It'll come right up, and check out all the things that we have to offer there.
And of course, don't forget to follow us on social media. You know, I had somebody asking me the other day how they could participate in the discussion online, and so you might want to bop right on over there to Facebook. We have a Facebook group that Jason moderates that is all about the discussions that we have on the podcast. And so if you have questions about things we discuss or insights about the program in general, comments you want to share, you can do that right there. And of course, we're also on Instagram. There's occasionally some interesting artistic displays that appear on our Instagram channel, which feature some of the travels from trips from over the years that the team members have made and other good things. And of course, you'll always get updates about the new episodes when they go out right there as well. So you can follow us on all those different channels, all the information about which you can find online at 7ages.org. I guess it's about time for us to get into this conversation now, Jason. Set the stage for us about this recent discussion you had with Roger Atwood.
Yeah, well, this episode tonight's a little bit different than what we normally present. We're speaking with a journalist tonight. Roger Atwood has worked for various archaeological media. He also, at the time of the discovery of the king of Sipan, he was working for Reuters, and he was actually on the ground in Peru and was able to witness all of the things in the book firsthand. This is a fascinating discussion. So much detail in the book. It reads very much like a movie. And there's so much that we didn't get to cover. And the book is Stealing History, Tomb Raiders, Smugglers, and the Looting of the Ancient World. And tonight, we're going to talk about the discovery of the King of Sipan down in Peru. And it is a fabulously interesting story. I think everyone's going to enjoy this.
I have no doubts. Coming up here in just a moment, Roger Atwood here on the 7Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the 7Ages Audio Journal, we have the pleasure of speaking with journalist Roger Atwood. Roger Atwood is the author of Stealing History, Tomb Raiders, Smugglers, and the Looting of the Ancient World. Roger is a contributing editor for archaeology and a frequent contributor to the Times Literary Supplement. His work has appeared in National Geographic, The Guardian, Mother Jones, The New York Times, Art News, and Scientific American, as well as numerous scholarly and literary journals. Roger is a journalist by profession and holds various degrees, including an MA in history from Georgetown University, a master's in international public policy from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and a BA in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Roger was a reporter and editor for Reuters from 1986 to 2002. Most of that time was in Latin America, including as its bureau chief in Chile and as editor in New York, Washington, and London. Roger, welcome to the 7Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, I tell you, Roger, over the years, we've had the show going for about 4 or 5 years now, and you are the first professional journalist that we've had the opportunity to have here on the show, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation tonight because you have a different viewpoint, you have a different set of experiences, and I'm very much looking forward to understanding your viewpoints from a journalistic perspective. So, of course, before we get into our main topic tonight, this fantastic book that you've written, Stealing History, Tomb Raiders, Smugglers, and the Looting of the Ancient World. I would like to know a little bit more about you. So do you have a long-term history, an archaeology interest? Where does that come from for you?
First of all, it's very nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I was born in Boston, raised in Massachusetts, and when I was being raised, when I was a kid, I was seeing a lot of old buildings being knocked down in the name of urban renewal in Boston and nearby, and I think that had a big impact on me. I really when I was quite young, had a very strong negative reaction to the destruction of old buildings, and which were very, very beautiful. And this was something that anybody who was living in Boston in those years, we're talking about the 1970s, would have experienced. So when I got to university at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, I started taking history courses and courses in ancient literature. And I was always very interested in the past, always reading about the past, and why, how we got to where we are at this moment in history. It's something that I was always wanted to delve into, and always found that the more I read about it, the more I understood the present. And then somewhere in there, I started taking courses in Latin American history. So UMass Amherst at that time was a great place to do that. There was a great core of Latin American historians, political scientists, literature specialists, who were very good at, generating enthusiasm amongst undergraduates for Latin American culture and history. So I majored in history, and then before I graduated, I'd done a fellowship in Argentina, at a university in Argentina. I'd worked as an intern at a newspaper in Mexico. I knew I was very interested in journalism then, and when I graduated, I had initially intended to go into an academic career, but went to Argentina to try to work in journalism, try to make my way as a journalist, or see what I could find a job in, just to sort of start living in Latin America a little bit, rather than just always studying it in books and libraries. And I found a job eventually. I was working at a radio station for a while, and then working at a small English language newspaper in Buenos Aires, and then got this job at Reuters. So I was, having, I think, a better time at it, a better career than I had expected when I graduated. And this is something I often advise under people who are about to graduate college. If you are not finding job prospects in your own country good enough, and they weren't very good in the early 80s in the United States, because the economy was in pretty deep recession, then go abroad. And that's what I did. And Reuters moved me from Argentina, and then I was in Brazil for a time, and then to Peru. And in Peru, I was there around 1989 to 1991, and which was a very dramatic time to be there. There was a terrible problem with guerrilla violence and a complete breakdown in public services, hyperinflation. And anyway, but the question was, how did I get interested in history? So I'm going off another subject, but I've always been interested in the past, and that's what led me to this subject, to write on the destruction of the past.
Well, that's really very telling. So as you're there in that arena, that area, with so much history, obviously you're aware of that. Were you seeking out specific assignments that related to the history, or were you just sort of working in general?
No, I was working in daily journalism. So I was working for Reuters, the news agency Reuters, which is the emphasis, the focus of Reuters at that time, and still was financial journalism. So I was writing mostly about the economies of Latin America, their macroeconomics, their central bank macroeconomic policies, inflation, also commodities markets. And at that time, the foreign debt crisis was a big issue as well. These Latin American economies had gotten very, very indebted by taking lots and lots of bank loans, and these banks were making lots of money by squeezing more and more money off these loans from these Latin American economies. And I think I just got tired of writing about ways in which US, European, banks were squeezing more and more money out of Latin America and started writing more features about history and about the underlying issues, so sometimes about social conditions. So I wrote lots of articles on shantytowns in Lima and, efforts to organize shantytown dwellers in slums on the outskirts of Lima, Peru. And I think I became over time became more interested in the issue of the destruction of historical sites, not just because of looting, because of site looting, but also because of urban sprawl, agriculture, the destruction of ancient sites for all kinds of reasons. And this was a very, very big issue in Peru. I think now it's a lot better. Now I think in the last decade or so, maybe more than that, the Peruvian government has been much more forthright about preserving sites and preserving the physical remains of the ancient cultures that lived in Peru before the arrival of Europeans in 1532. So, but at that time, looting and destruction of ancient sites was a huge problem, and I would witness this, and I thought, I am a journalist, and I think when you see a good story, a journalist sees a good story, you just kind of climb all over it. You want to go deeply into it, and that's what I was able to do. So I left Peru. I was briefly in New York, and then I was in Chile as the bureau chief for Reuters, which was a great place to be for a while. But I'd always been interested in Peru. I don't know how many of your listeners have been to Peru. It is absolutely fascinating. Of all the countries I worked in, it is the one that I found the most fascinating. It's a country with these layers and layers of history. You've got the post-independence, post-1824 Republican period, the period of the Republic of Peru, but beneath that, you've got the colonial Peru, and then beneath that, you've got the Inca Peru. And I'm saying, when I say beneath that, I'm talking very literally. You see these archaeological layers. So you've got Inca, and then before the Inca, depending on what part of Peru you're in, you've got all these previous cultures that stretch back thousands of years before the Incas. Wadi, Chimu, Moche, Lambayeque, Ichma, all these very distinct, very identifiable cultures in the archaeological and historical record of Peru. So all to say that for anybody who's interested in history, ancient history, there really is nothing like Peru. It's for someone who is interested in writing on these subjects, it's a great place to be.
No, I agree completely with you on that. Peru is certainly an absolute treasure trove of history and archaeology. Before we get into the main topic for tonight, which is the events that occurred in and around Sipan, describe for our listeners, just, you touched on it there fairly well, but really archaeologically, what was the state of these sites as urban sprawl continues, as looters continue? Give us a little bit of insight into how these things were being destroyed. How were they being exploited? What would it look like from an outsider's view?
Yeah, well, I think you had some archaeological sites that were very well preserved and lavished with grants and had lots of tourism and lots of people studying there, doing archaeological digs there, but there weren't very many, and they were mostly Inca sites. You had Machu Picchu, of course. Around that time, Choqquequirao, which is another really important Inca site, was rediscovered. You had a site called Chan Chan in the north, which is this big mud brick city, which isn't Inca, it's Chimu, but it's more or less contemporaneous with the Incas. So I was talking about destruction of lots of sites for lots of reasons, caused by lots of phenomena. But it's also important to note that there were lots of sites, lots of sites that were very well looked after and very well preserved in the late, that were dating mostly from the late 1400s, early 1500s. So, just at the kind of the late stage of pre-Hispanic civilizations. And those sites in a strange way, I think the preservation of those sites was kind of the sense that only Inca sites, or that Inca sites were more worthy of preservation than other sites, earlier ancient sites, was in a strange way kind of a response to the idea that the Incas told the Spaniards when they came, when the Spaniards arrived in Peru in the 1500s. The message that they got from these Inca elders, who were often interviewed by these Spanish chroniclers, was that, oh, before us, they were all just barbarians. Yes, there were lots of cultures, Spanish chroniclers, Spanish priests, Spanish, scientists, I guess you could call them, or sort of proto-anthropologists in the 16th century, were finding all these things. We're finding sites, we're finding artifacts that didn't look Inca. They were obviously before the Inca, and they would ask the Incas about this, and the Incas would say, no, you don't even think about, don't bother studying these people. They're all just barbarians. And I think that idea that the Inca civilization was this kind of apex of all the civilizations that came before it, and that all that came before it was uninteresting and or barbaric or kind of savage, was something that's kind of had held through all the centuries since then, and had sort of found its way into scholarship and into Inca and into Peruvian kind of mainstream thinking. So there was this sense that the Inca sites were the only ones that were worth preserving. And that had only recently started to change when I was there. The mid-20th century archaeologists, Julio Ceteo is the most famous, lots of Peruvian archaeologists and foreign archaeologists were doing things like preserving the Nazca lines in the south of Peru, and Chavín de Huántar, which is this amazing site way up in the Andes, very, very early site, 2,000 years before the Incas. And so there was this, people were starting to preserve these sites that were pre-Inca. But there was, I detected still, and even to some extent still is, this kind of general mainstream idea that the ancient Peru is synonymous with the Incas, and that what came before the Incas is somehow inferior. So a lot of those sites were the ones that were being looted, and there was this sense that when you had moche tombs, which date from about from the early first millennium AD, that these sites were being more heavily looted, and that they didn't deserve the same kind of protection that sites like Machu Picchu and Choqquequirao were getting, and Chan Chan. So that had to change. So, and that was what has changed since. But at that time, I think that idea was still persisting, and these sites were more subject to looting and to destruction by urban sprawl. I mean, I remember one of the, in Lima, for example, and I mentioned this in the book, in Stealing History, the building that is now the National Institute of Culture is built in this kind of skyscraper that is built on top of an ancient mound, a pre-Inca mound in a neighborhood of Lima. So, this gives you a sense of how, you could say indifferent. I don't think it's indifference. I think there was also the sense that there are just so many ancient sites here. There are so many ancient burial mounds all over, hundreds of thousands of ancient sites all over Peru, that that was this kind of inexhaustible resource, that there was no end to all the ancient sites you could get in Peru. And that's not the case. And that's something I came up often of archaeologists who would say, there's so much looting, there is so much destruction of ancient sites that sooner or later we're not going to have any ancient sites. They'll be all gone.
When we talk about looting, obviously there's looting, small L looting, and then there's big L looting, international looting. And could you describe what the international looting is like, just briefly, who's involved with it, if you can, and just a little bit of a background before we move on?
The international illicit trade in artifacts, it depends on people looting and commercial grave robbing. It depends on people looting ancient sites. And I think when I started this book, people came up with the idea. People would often express this idea that looting was this kind of small scale problem with people digging up tombs late at night, or that they were just starving people in poor countries who were digging up coins to make a living, and what's wrong with that? And what I found as I started delving into this and doing more research on the subject and seeing how it worked on the ground in Peru and Guatemala, a few other countries where I did research for this book, was that that really wasn't the case with the looting industry. It had become this very streamlined, globalized business in which the suppliers who were looters, who were digging up ancient tombs, pillaging tombs, and then selling what they find to the valuable things that they find to dealers, that these people were very much in contact with the buyers. So it had become this very kind of buyer-focused market like any other, and that they were digging up ancient sites, plundering these sites with a kind of efficiency and in a way that was much more systematic than had been widely understood, but also much more systematic than had been done in the past. So there's always been looting. There's always been plunder. There was always, civilizations, or, Napoleon looting museums of Europe, people looting Etruscan tombs in Italy for many centuries. But what's happening now, what I think happened really in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, was that looting became this much bigger, much more systematic, globalized industry in which people buying looted goods usually in rich countries, but not always, were able to buy a much bigger variety of goods, and were able to be in much closer contact with the people who were supplying them, with the suppliers, who were in effect the looters, the commercial grave robbers, and the middlemen who were bringing those things, those objects to market. And that's what I think is new, and that was what was really kind of drilling the life out of these ancient sites in a way that had not happened before.
Yes, it's very involved with many moving parts. And again, Roger, that's why I'm glad that you are here tonight to discuss some of the ins and outs of this from a different view. But let's move now to Sipan. So for those who may not understand or have a familiarization with this particular area of Peru, tell us a little bit about geographically, what does the area look like, and how did you find yourself there in Sipan?
Okay, it's quite, this is on the north coast of Peru. It's quite arid. It's interesting. It often reminds people of North Africa because it's a place where the desert meets the sea, and the sea is incredibly rich. It's one of the richest, has some of the richest fishing grounds in the world, wonderful shellfish. And that's really important because that's really what sustains these ancient societies over many, many centuries, is the marine resources. So I was always as I was saying, I was very interested in the subject of historical preservation and the threats to it. And I have to say, I've actually pitched an article to a magazine called Art News, which is a magazine in New York, on this subject. I didn't think they'd take it, but they did. So I got them to send me to this, to do an article on the illicit antiquities trade, which was a subject that was starting to get more attention. And the place to report it seemed to be Peru. Art News is a magazine about the art market. The editor at that time, Robin Sembelis, was very interested in the subject. And so, but I think they thought of it as mainly a phenomenon in the Mediterranean, in Italy, in Turkey, these countries that had started to put pressure on American museums to return looted artifacts that were in the collections of big American museums that had been or were strongly suspected to have been looted from ancient tombs. Right. So the story that I was proposing was to do this story from Peru, where I'd lived before, where I'd been a reporter. So I came from the story. I came to the story, from the bottom of it, in a sense, that I was coming to it from the supply side rather than from the buying side. And that was a new kind of angle. So had an old friend of mine in Lima who collected pots old ceramic vessels from Inca and pre-Inca civilizations. And I said to him, listen, can you connect me with the people who sell this to you? So he connected me with a dealer, and then the dealer connected me with, or introduced me to one of his buyers. And I didn't sort of, to one of his suppliers, I should say, one of the looters who was supplying him. So I sort of let them assume that I was interested in buying. And I say this in the book, that I wanted to buy these ancient artifacts. Of course I didn't, but that's what I sort of let them assume this without correcting them. But I did tell people that I was a journalist, and people knew that I was a journalist. So I met this looter, this professional grave robber, whose job was to dig up tombs and sell the artifacts that he would find to his dealers. And then so he showed me some of the places where he worked. I explained to him what I wanted to do. And, he got some good references on me from my friend, the collector. And then this looter introduced me to some other looters. And I soon found myself amongst this whole kind of network of commercial grave robbers who would go up and down the coast of Peru. And I talk about this in the book, who would go up and down the coast of Peru, busting into old ancient sites and ancient tombs for the benefit of some of their collectors. And, the fact that I was able to do this, the fact that that these people were operating with such impunity and were able to sort of bring this, gringo journalist along, I think speaks to how widely tolerated this was. And at the time, I don't think it is so much anymore, but at that time, how really out in the open it was at the time. But there had been this, while I was doing this, the grand case of looting was in Sipan, the case you mentioned, which was this group of ancient tombs a bit further up the coast than where I was with this network of looters, in a place called Chiclayo on the north coast. And Sipan was this, around 200 AD, it must have been this kind of capital of this whole monarchy, this whole state of the Moche civilization, because there were these ancient burial mounds, and in those burial mounds were these fabulously rich tombs with gold and silver artifacts. Pre-Hispanic civilizations had incredibly well-developed metallurgy. A lot of people are surprised to hear that. There are people who are not really familiar with Andean civilizations are surprised to hear this, but they did have extremely well-developed gold and silver smelting. They never developed iron, which was a key difference from civilizations in the old world. So 1987, these looters who had been working for a long, long time in this area found these ancient tombs. And that is what started the whole Sipan gold rush.
Yes, and it's a fascinating story. Again, we encourage everyone to pick the book up. There's so much detail in there that Roger has included. It is a fantastic read. So, Roger, take us back to December 2001, first arriving in Sipan, and also introduce us to Walter Alva.
Yeah, I'll start with the second one. Walter is a wonderful archaeologist. He's an archaeologist, very well respected, widely published, has excavated all kinds of sites in the north coast of Peru, pre-Hispanic sites. He is also a very strong advocate for preserving and for scientifically excavating ancient sites and protecting them from the looting industry. And it is an industry. And protecting them in ways that are more proactive than I think people understood. It's not just about putting fences around them, but actually mobilizing, raising consciousness of rural peoples in northern Peru and elsewhere, places that have lots of great ancient sites, lots of great heritage, mobilizing people and encouraging them to see the ancient sites in their midst as community assets, things worth preserving, like good water or preserving topsoil for farming, things like that, rather than seeing them as just this windfall to be exploited by looters. So he's very much a kind of a public figure in Peru. He's a public intellectual as an archaeologist and that. And I've always been struck in Peru by how intellectuals are very, very important people. I think Peru, and I can't think of any other country. Sometimes I think maybe Britain, but I think Peru is a country where archaeologists are real celebrities more than any other place. They appear often in the media talking about cultural issues, and they're very, very widely respected, in part because it has this incredibly rich archaeological heritage. And I think Walter has really led the way on that, on archaeologists taking a very public stand in favor of historic preservation and archaeological integrity. And so when I came to Peru in 2001 to start the research for this article, which then turned into this book, Stealing History, I went to Sipan. I'd never been there before until then. And all these townspeople, even though the looting had happened 14 years earlier, in 1987, the townspeople were still railing against Walter Alva. Basically, this site had been looted in 1987. The police got wind of it, that this site was being looted, that these incredibly rich and beautiful, valuable artifacts were making their way onto the antiquities market. Alva got wind of this and got his friends in the police to chase off the looters off the site. And then Walter brought that site under archaeological excavation. And that excavation had gone on for 10 years. So Walter was then able to find other tombs in this burial mound. This is gigantic burial mound. It stands maybe, it's about 5 stories tall. It's huge. And the looters' pits went down into the interior of it. And Walter Alva, this archaeologist, and a few other archaeologists who were working with him at the time, they were able to find much more than the looters had destroyed. The looters had wrecked one of these old tombs, but there were 2 other big tombs that they'd missed. And that's what Walter was able to excavate. And the burial mound had been fenced off, had been put under permanent police guard. There were cameras around it. It was this high-value site that was under archaeological excavation to prevent the local people from coming in and destroying it. And so the townspeople, some of the townspeople, I don't think all, but some of the townspeople, some of the people who had been looting other cemeteries around the town and in nearby villages really hated him, and had all these big banners denouncing him for coming and stealing our artifacts, the artifacts to which they felt entitled. I think it's important to note that these, you might see, and I hear this sometimes from people saying that these sites, these people were the descendants of the Moche people who created these tombs, who left these treasures. And they really weren't their descendants, because these towns had been created by sugar workers. Sugar workers had migrated to this part of Peru from other parts of Peru. So they were actually, most of them actually quite recent migrants to this area. And these villages had been created by these the people who were the cane cutters on these sugar plantations that had been created in the 1940s, the 1950s. They had been nationalized in the 1970s and then since privatized. But they were the descendants of agricultural workers who had been brought there, who had come there, migrated there from elsewhere in Peru.
Yeah, very good point. And I have heard that argument on many occasions. But the story of the discovery of the Lord of Sipan cannot be told without understanding the role that the Bernal brothers played. So Samuel and Erno. So going back to the 1980s, before the site was protected under the vision of Walter Alva, tell us about the looting precedent that was set by the Bernal brothers, because they are a huge part of this story. So give us their story and what it was that they found that was so important to what Walter would discover later on.
Well, the Bernal brothers were these legendary looters. They were known up and down the north coast of Peru for being very good at discovering tombs, busting into them and then taking out a few valuable things, finding valuable pre-Hispanic artifacts and selling them. And looting up to that time had a lot of kind of ritual properties. It had been associated with shamans and with ritualistic offerings to the spirits of the dead on these tombs. And there are some anthropologists who've written about this, and very, very interesting material out there on this subject. And what I was finding with the Bernal brothers is what they were doing was a really different kind of looting, which was just strictly commercial. And this ties into what I was saying before about how the looting industry was really changing in the 1980s, right in front of us in the 1980s and 1990s, and how the Bernal brothers were this new kind of looter. How they weren't interested in incantations and shamans and making ritualistic offerings to the dead and the spirits of the dead. They were very interested in just busting into tombs, getting out the valuable stuff, and trashing everything else. So they had been working at ancient sites, unprotected or very underprotected, ancient mounds all over the north coast of Peru, ancient cemeteries, and grabbing this stuff, and they had a very good network of buyers. So they happened to live very near the Sipan burial mound. A burial mound in Peru is called a huaca, and the huaca, the Sipan huaca, happened to be just a couple miles down from their house next to the sugar plantation. And they'd heard that people were finding little gold beads and things, or little copper elements and things, and they had enough, these looters, the Bernal brothers, had enough, let's say, empirical knowledge of ancient sites to know that where there were copper artifacts, there were likely to be gold artifacts and silver artifacts, which they could get into and sell. So they started digging there. Emile Bernal started digging there. And this night in February 1987, he and his buddies, which included his brother Samuel and I think a couple of other brothers, and then several of their friends, found this tomb and dug into it. It was 23 feet down from the surface, and they'd actually dug into it from underneath it. They were digging. They had this long kind of shaft digging into this tomb. Samuel described this to me. It was went all the way down into the tomb, and then there were these kind of branches coming out from the shafts at the bottom of it, and they were in one of these lateral shafts when they dug in, when the roof of it collapsed and actually nearly buried Bernal, almost buried him alive, and he was able to go into the tomb from the bottom up. And so these artifacts actually literally fell on top of him. They even fell into his lap, quite literally. And so he would take out these artifacts and then bring them up through the shaft, through this long ladder, which came up to the top of the burial mound. And they looked at them in the moonlight and saw these artifacts and knew that they'd made an incredible discovery. They, over the next several nights, started hacking into the tomb, excavating and taking out huge numbers of these really, really phenomenally valuable artifacts, which very soon, in a question of weeks, were making their way into the international antiquities trade. They were going through London. A bunch wound up in Los Angeles. Some made their way to New York. So what I talk about in this book is how much this site showed the destructive power of not just these looters, but of the whole trade, the whole globalized antiquities trade, the illicit trade that was really destroying so much ancient heritage and destroying our knowledge of the past. Because, and this is a really important point, I think I make this in the book, and it needs to be repeated that looters, when they go into these sites, you really can't excavate the site, or it's hard to excavate the site afterwards, because they destroy the knowledge, all the contextual knowledge that archaeologists rely on to describe these civilizations that leave these tombs, gets destroyed when they're looted. So, everything we know about the ancient world, how people lived, how they raised their children, what they ate, what kinds of buildings they made, everything, all our knowledge about the ancient world comes from archaeology. This is how we know about these things. And this is especially true in Latin America, because there were almost no societies that had writing. So in some societies, you have written texts about how people lived in ancient times. You don't have that in Latin America, and almost anywhere. You have a little bit in the Maya world, but that lasted only a certain number of centuries, writing. But in Peru, there was no societies were literate. So we really are reliant on the archaeology to tell us how people lived in ancient times. And that's what's destroyed when these sites get looted. And that's what was happening at Sipan.
Context is everything there. And I'm just curious, as far as objects that are, and the types of artifacts that are popular on the international market, obviously the gold and precious metals and those types of things, but is there specific categories of things that are more sought after than others that may not be, intuitive exactly to the common person?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, things on the illicit antiquities market, things come in and out of vogue. Certain cultures, certain countries, certain kinds of artifacts come in and out of fashion. For a long time, ceramics were very popular. Ancient ceramics, ancient pots and things were really popular, but then there was a big glut of those. And that by the time the Sipan artifacts started coming onto the market, ceramic artifacts were not fetching the kind of money they had in the past. So, and Sipan really, so many artifacts came out of the Bernal brothers' illegal excavation that it really kind of generated this great interest in, it was kind of catalyzing this whole market movement towards metal artifacts. And then other looters went around other parts of northern Peru, busting into more and more tombs, usually at night. And they did find some other important tombs with valuable metalwork, with gold and silver metalwork. And I talk about this in the book as well. There was a place called La Mina, just south of Sipan, which was another really important illicit excavation whose artifacts came on the market around the same time. But at that time also, there was a great interest in ancient textiles, which had sort of come in and out of the market. They're much harder to find. It's much harder to preserve them. The coast of Peru is very arid, so those they tend to preserve pretty well. So there was a great interest in ancient textiles, which could be made of, in the case of Peru, could be made of llama wool or a type of cotton called barbadense, which is the Native American cotton. So those were fetching really top dollar at that time. And that was more focused on the south coast of Peru. So there wasn't a lot of textiles. There weren't a lot of textiles in the areas where the Bernal brothers were working. But some of the looters who had been working with the Bernal brothers and working near the Bernal brothers on the north coast had started to migrate down to the south coast. I mean, like businessmen anywhere. It was incredibly, attuned to the demands of the market of the buyers. They'd migrated to the south coast to look for textiles. So all these looters, some of the ones that the gang that I'd been going around with, they'd been taking buses down to the south coast to bust into tombs there, and making kind of deals with some of the south coast looters who were looking for textiles. There was a time there also when wood artifacts were also very popular on the market, and those also would survive in dry conditions like you get on the coast of Peru. So yeah, very much. I think that's absolutely right. I think there were certain kinds of artifacts that buyers wanted, and they were able to, and not just in Peru, but all over the world, they were able to send signals down the line through the whole trade that this is what buyers wanted. This is what you saw in Iraq too, which I talk about. My book's dealing with, basically it begins and ends in Iraq. This was what fueled a lot of the trade, a lot of the looting and the illicit trade in antiquities from Iraq after the 2003 war, was this great interest by buyers, by collectors in cylinder seals and in Sumerian votive plaques. So it's you see this all over the world, this phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely. It's an ongoing problem and issue that we've seen virtually in every country. So, Roger, before we move on to the night of February 25th, 1987, I think it's important that we cover a little bit of the attitude toward archaeology of the people at the time. So some of the characters that you describe in the book play such a critical role to the story. So let's briefly touch on people like Frank Drew and Enrico Pole, and something else that I found really fascinating that seemed to aid the looters was the loophole in the registration process of the National Institute of Culture. So if you could tell us a little bit about some of those specific characters and then about that loophole and how it affected looting in the area.
Okay, Fred Drew was a fellow who had worked at the U.S. Embassy for a time, but had become a buyer and dealer of ancient artifacts. So some of the looters that were buying artifacts, some of the looters who had found artifacts at Sipan were selling directly or indirectly some of the pieces to Fred Drew. And he had his apartment in Lima, Peru, and was buying these artifacts. And interestingly, some of the looters that I was dealing with later in the early 2000s, this is 15, 20 years after Drew had started going into this, they were also selling to Fred Drew, and they knew him as this very kind of mild-mannered, elderly man from the United States. And so a lot of the artifacts that went from the Sipan tombs and then found their way onto the international antiquities market were handled by Fred Drew in his collection. He kept some as well in his own collection. I don't know what's happened to Fred Drew. I've tried to find out what happened to him, if he's still alive, if he's still in business, if he is alive. I don't know. He's really kind of, after this all happened, he kind of dropped off the map. Enrico Poli he passed away recently. He was this collector who actually bought a very large number of Sipan artifacts and was completely open, completely transparent about exhibiting them at his private museum in his house in Lima. He had some very strange theories about where what these artifacts meant. He was Italian by birth, had migrated to Peru right after the Second World War. People said that he had been a fascist sympathizer of Mussolini in the war, and this is why he left. But he fancied himself as this great kind of connoisseur of culture, and that this was part of his Italian heritage, that he imagined himself as this great Renaissance man who was buying the great treasures of ancient Peru and putting them on display in this private museum. And he had very antagonistic relationships with the archaeologists, because the archaeologists knew that he was fomenting the destruction of these ancient sites. So there were these archaeologists, and they would turn up to do excavations at ancient sites, and they'd find them covered in looters or covered in looters' pits, because looters had been excavating these sites and then selling the artifacts to Poli. And Poli was able to do this because, as you mentioned, the Peruvian law at that time allowed people to amass private collections of these artifacts. The sites themselves would be, it was contradictory, nonsensical law would allow sites to be preserved that had sites, off limits to looting, but then these sites could be looting, and then the artifacts themselves would be allowed to be, could be legally bought and sold. So looters would be able to find artifacts in ancient sites and then legally sell them, even though the actual act of looting was itself illegal. So it makes no sense. Anyway, Peru had never really sorted this out legally, and it allowed these powerful, wealthy collectors like Poli, although many others, to amass these collections of pillaged artifacts. But they couldn't export them, and this was very, very important. The idea was that they were not going to be allowed to. It would be illegal for them to sell these artifacts on the international market. Many of them did it anyway. This was as the Sipan case showed. But theoretically, legally, they weren't allowed to export them. So they were allowed to have these collections of pillaged artifacts as long as they stayed in Peru. I think these laws have changed. I'm not completely sure. I haven't followed too carefully how things have evolved since then. But I do believe, I think these laws have changed since then. I think it's now more difficult to amass private collections of looted artifacts in Peru.
Yeah, well, we would certainly hope so. And, as we really now at this point are going to move forward and really get into the specifics of the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, take us back to midnight, February 25th, 1987. So discuss the ordeal of Walter Alva and the local police. How did this happen?
I should say, first of all, Alva, this archaeologist, Walter Alva, he had very good contacts amongst the police. And this has really helped him over the years. The police allowed him to keep tabs on these ancient sites. And this area of northern Peru has got these big burial mounds all over the landscape. There's tremendous amount of a tremendous number of ancient sites where archaeologists can work, but also where looters can work. And what happened was, as the looting, the Bernal brothers and their friends, their gang, started finding these artifacts and then selling them to dealers, it really became impossible to hide. And the police got wind of this, and they let Alva know, and they came to his house and knocked on his door and said, we've got some artifacts for you to see. We think they're pretty important. So Alva goes to the police station, and the police, if I remember right, I think they had actually by then had the first of a couple of raids of the Bernal brothers' house, and they found a rice sack with some of these artifacts that they had looted. So they open up the rice sack, they show the artifacts to Walter Alva, and Walter Alva immediately realizes that they've discovered an extremely important tomb, an extremely important Moche tomb, which dated from about 2,000 years earlier, and that the looters had made an extraordinary discovery. And so the next day, he and the police they figure out where this looting is happening, and they chase the looters off the site with tear gas and with truncheons and things. No bullets at this point. And then put the site under guard. And that's what allows Alva to start excavating the site. And then very soon after that, they go to the Bernal house and raid the house to find what artifacts the Bernal brothers have there. And Walter brings a metal detector to see if they buried things in the garden of the house. And Neil Bernal, the leader of the looters, he's the master looter, he runs out of the house, and the police, I think, very, very unwisely fire their weapons at him, and he falls and he dies at the base of this avocado tree, which then later becomes this kind of shrine to the memory of the village people who kind of worshipped him, put all these little offerings underneath the avocado tree where Neil Bernal dies. And what they'd done by then was the looters had buried these metal artifacts underneath their cockfighters. They were also, apart from looting, they were also masters of cockfighting, which is a very popular activity on the North Coast. I saw it actually just recently. I think that's also illegal, but it's also kind of tolerated, or it's illegal, but the prohibition against it is difficult to enforce. So people, they had these fighting roosters, and they had buried them underneath the fighting roosters. So they actually had these fighting cocks as the kind of guardians of the artifacts. Somehow Walter missed these with his metal detector. He didn't find these in the cock's pen, but they did find some artifacts, and they were able to grab some of the artifacts, to take back some of the artifacts that had been looted. One that they missed was the famous backflap, which was the biggest gold artifact of them all. And that was this gigantic piece of body armor of basically solid gold. And it is in fact the largest gold artifact ever discovered in the Americas. And that the police never found. And it was looted by the Bernal brothers from the tomb. and shuttled through the international antiquities market until it was finally discovered in 1997 with some smugglers in Philadelphia.
A fascinating concept of how far these, internationally, these things can move and where they can eventually be found. So at this point, Alva knows there's something very important going on that's being found, that's being discovered on the site, the excavation. So take us to the next step. They now have the clues. They can see what's being taken out of this area. Now, one thing that I think is important to highlight here is that initial discovery that you described to us earlier of the artifacts literally falling down onto the lap. That was not the main tomb, correct? That was one of the outer chambers of what would become known as the Lord of Sipan. Is that correct?
That's probably correct. We don't really know. The way that the looters describe what they found is, who knows? It was, they're looters. They're not really gathering information about the tomb. They're just looking for these phenomenally valuable artifacts that they can sell. So we don't really know, but there was at least one very, very big tomb that the looters found, possibly two, if I remember right. But the ones that they missed, so they discovered this tomb, and then nearby, which they didn't have time to get into, there was the tomb of the son of the person whose tomb they discovered. So the next generation, and the father of that person. That's what Walter Alva thinks. You can't be completely sure because there's no archaeological information associated with it. But it looked like the looters had got the middle generation of this at least three person dynasty, that then Alva was able to excavate the son of this person, whom he called the Lord of Sipan, and then that person's grandfather, whom he called the old man of Sipan, El Viejo de Sipan. And so this is one of the, I think it's the oldest or one of the oldest known dynasties in Latin American history. And that's what Alva was able to excavate. Sorry, did that answer your question?
Yes, no, that's it perfectly. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure everyone understands when Alva goes in to do this excavation, really this salvage excavation, I just wanted everyone to see what was present and what was known at the time. So once he gets into this emergency salvage excavation of the tomb site, describe some of the obstacles that he encounters that he has to overcome while doing the excavation. And then let's talk about what he discovered that the looters had missed.
Yeah, he's got these, he's working on this archaeological site, which is surrounded by this big fence, and there are armed guards. He had a revolver as well during part of this excavation. He didn't have to use it, fortunately, but they're constantly, people, the kind of would-be looters are constantly throwing things at him. They're kind of, lobbing things over the fences at him while he and his archaeologists are trying to excavate the site. Before they start excavating the other tombs, before they discover these undisturbed tombs, he goes into the looter's pit and finds this very interesting scepter, which is a really, really important piece. And if you go to the tomb of the Sipan Museum now in Lambayeque, northern Peru, you can see this scepter, and it has this kind of, it's this, I don't know what the looters would have done with it. They probably wouldn't, since it's not gold, it's copper, so they probably would have just thrown it away. They probably would just trash it. But it's this, it's called a scepter. We don't really know if it was a scepter or that's a very European term for something that was, but it's a kind of a staff, which would be kind of a symbol of power. And on the top of it is this little kind of box, which shows in relief this kind of a house or a little kind of hut with the Lord of Sipan sitting in it, and then surrounded by these deities. And these deities are in all kinds of different configurations. It's hard for me to describe, but it's an extraordinary piece. The usual kind of European ways of describing art somehow just don't work when you're talking about pre-Hispanic art. It's a very funny thing. If I describe some of these things, it doesn't do justice to them somehow.
Sure.
even the back flap and the, which the looters had discovered, and these golden rattles they discovered. I mean, what they show in the middle of them is this kind of spider-like figure with a knife in one hand and a severed head in the other, which sounds sort of Hollywood or something, but when you see them, it actually is quite terrifying, and it is a real symbol of power that the people who are wearing these artifacts were meant to be worn and meant to be used and kind of manipulated by human hands. They had ritualistic purposes in the ceremonies that were carried out on this burial tomb. They were finding these artifacts that were actually playing roles, and they were kind of props in this bloodletting ceremony in which prisoners would be taken up to the top of the burial mound and their blood drawn, and then they'd be and their blood drunk by these priests, and then they would be killed. There's a lot of archaeological evidence and art historical evidence for the fact that these were, some of it discovered at Sipan by the archaeologists, that these ritual ceremonies, these sacrificing ceremonies, were in fact the depictions of them on pots and paintings on pots were in fact true. Right, they did actually happen. And since at some other sites in northern Peru, they've actually found the bodies of these sacrifice victims as well. The remains of them, skeletal remains of them, of these sacrificial victims. So this is the sort of information that gets lost when these sites are looted. When these sites are looted, I mean, this all just gets destroyed. All the information that comes with these that comes with these artifacts.
No, it's a great point, and we have the same problems here in the United States with, the tombs and the looting and all the issues that have happened here as well. Very, very similar. So on June 14th, I know that Alva made some very significant discoveries, paintings, again, references like you just talked about to the site being used as human sacrifice and ceremonial cannibalism, gold, silver, copper, beads, precious stones, ear spools, all of those things, including a incredible necklace made of golden discs. So these type of, just as you're describing, the context is so important. Where are these things located? How are they distributed? How are they laid out within the tomb? All of that tells the story. So as these things are being discovered, so many of them are mentioned in the book, and specifically there's one I want to discuss because it is so very striking and the craftsmanship is so unreal, which is referred to as the peanut necklace, or the so-called peanut necklace. But let's talk a bit about that particular discovery, because it's the level of craftsmanship on this piece is truly amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece, and I should say I saw that piece for the first time actually in New York at the Museum of Natural History, an exhibit that really changed my life, and I think it was really got me interested in this subject, and specifically in Sipan. This was a necklace that was excavated by Walter Alva, and he discovered the necklace being worn by the Lord of Sipan in his coffin, a wooden coffin tied with these kind of copper straps, and had this incredible array of necklaces and jewelry around his body, on top of his body, on top of the remains. The remains at that time were only some splintered human bones. The artifacts were all there, and Alva was able to excavate it very, very carefully and properly in line with archaeological practice. And the necklace has one group of beads. They're in the form of peanuts. One group that is on one side is all gold, and the other side is all silver. And the idea of the gold is associated with the sun and with masculinity, and the silver side is associated with the moon and with femininity. And there's been a lot of scholarly writing on this, on the meaning of gold and the gold and silver in Moche iconography. And it should also be said that the looters also discovered a peanut necklace like this. They completely destroyed it. They just took out the beads. They just sort of yanked them out and sold some of the beads. And the beads wound up in Enrique Poli's collection. But it wasn't clear at all that these beads had been part of a necklace. They were just, they were these just sort of random stray objects as they came out of the looter's tomb. what Alva was able to show was that they were part of the kind of royal garb, that they were, considered this part of this object. They were part of this particular object that had been worn by this Moche monarch in his tomb that he'd taken with him to his death. And they are, it's an extraordinary piece. And, done in 2,000 years later after they were made, they don't fail to dazzle everyone who sees them.
Yes, and again, they truly are fantastic. Those are pictured in the book. In the middle, there's several photographs. That is one of them. So yet another reason to pick up Stealing History, Tomb Raiders, Smugglers, and the Looting of the Ancient World. As we begin to wrap it up here, Roger, there's a couple things that I want people to understand. One of which is the book has more detail. It has other stories, other cases. So again, I encourage you to pick that up. There's a lot more to learn from the book. But besides that, once the Lord of Sipan was found, and there was many, many other incredible artifacts that were found, absolutely amazing. And you can look up the Lord of Sipan online. There's plenty of photographs for you to see this for yourself, and I encourage you to do so. But Roger, once this was discovered and sort of the importance of this discovery was known, what was the local attitude? Did that increase ownership of what was being found? Did they feel like there was something there truly worth protecting, or did that just encourage more looting in the area?
Well, it's a complicated picture, I think. There were some villages that really took to the message by archaeologists, Walton and other archaeologists, about preserving the ancient assets in their midst. Others, some villages really never got up past it, including Sipan, never got past the idea of looking at ancient sites as these sites that should be exploited in the worst sense, and just artifacts stolen and sold as quickly as possible. There were other villages where Alva and some other archaeologists were able to form these, what were called grupas, these archaeological protection brigades. And I spent a little while, I have a chapter in this in the book, I go around with these brigades, and what they are doing is they have walkie-talkies, they have dirt bikes, and they go around preserving the sites and basically conducting surveillance of ancient sites, ancient burial mounds, ancient cemeteries. And if they see looters coming there, they call the police, or they try to surround them, and they keep a constant watch on these ancient sites. That proved to be one of the chapters that got the most attention, actually, from the book. Was this chapter that is very much on a solution, and a solution that works, and a solution that empowers rural people to preserve these sites, and preserve the sites for archaeological research, for tourism, but also to, as an element of pride in their own past and of their nation's past. And this is something that archaeologists elsewhere in the world have started working with. It's worked in Mali in West Africa. There's been some work on this in Guatemala, a little bit in Iraq as well, about preserving the task of kind of enrolling local people to form these, I don't want to call them militias because they're usually not armed, but these kind of surveillance brigades aimed at preserving these sites. And you really have to get very down in the weeds to do this. And the archaeologists who've done this have often had great success. But it's also a part of, it relies on consciousness raising and telling people why these sites should be preserved, what they are, why they matter. And, treating people like grown-ups and talking to them about these assets in the midst. I mean, I think, and it's something that people can do in this country as well. This terrible problem of looting of Civil War battlefields and cemeteries and ancient sites in the Southwest, and getting people involved in preserving them. It's come a long way. There's a lot of creativity and innovation going into ancient site preservation around the world. It's an area of great growth that I think is in response to the destruction of so much sites by the illicit antiquities trade.
There's something that's kind of been on my mind the entire time. Question: this all has sort of an Indiana Jones, kind of a feel to it in a way, especially, in regards to the looters and their relationships with each other and the authorities. But my question is really for you on what was the security situation like for yourself, just reporting on these types of things? Does that put you in any kind of personal danger? I realize there's sort of an international crime aspect to this, and maybe some larger, more serious organizations. I was just curious about that.
I didn't in Peru. I have any serious security worries. I did in Iraq. When I was visiting some of these ancient sites, I was with my driver, translator, combination bodyguard, but we weren't armed. And I'd been warned against visiting some of these sites, and I was terrified, I have to say. And I was when we were visiting some of these sites in Iraq, with an archaeologist who had worked there and who was very distressed to see the site being destroyed by looters. This is in 2003. In Peru, I was always very careful, I'd say that, about where I would meet with people, who I would meet with. It would always be by daylight, ideally in a public place. When I would visit some of these sites with them, there's some pictures of them in the book. I would make sure that people know where I'm going. I would have a cell phone with me, taking, I think, elementary precautions. But, as I was saying, I think the fact that these looters act so much out in the open was sort of part of the problem that I was describing, in the sense that they really didn't feel me as a threat, that they didn't necessarily feel that they had anything to hide, that they were operating in a way that seemed to them, within everyday practice.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things to keep in mind. These things can be dangerous, and certainly when you're dealing with people's livelihood and also cultural significance, there's things to be considered. We have been speaking tonight with Roger Atwood, author of Stealing History, Tomb Raiders, Smugglers, and the Looting of the Ancient World. So, Roger, I want to give the final word tonight to you as we wrap this up. What are your final thoughts on this book and the cases in there? What would you like readers to take away from the book? And finally, how can they contact you? What is your website, and what's the best place to buy the book?
Sure. My websites are my name, rogeratwood.com, and you can buy the book there. It's on all the, it was published by St. Martin's Press, 2004, and it's you can buy it at any place you buy books. It's not so much in bookstores anymore, but you can buy it at any online dealer. Just 2 points I'd like to make. One is, I talk a lot in this book. The book begins and ends in Iraq, as I said. I talk about Guatemala, Cambodia, Mali, Hong Kong. I talk about other places, Italy, countries that have lost a lot of their archaeological heritage to the illicit antiquities trade. But, the book does focus on Peru because I really wanted to. I didn't want to go around the world just getting kind of the same story everywhere, the same depressing story about destruction of ancient sites around the world. So I really wanted to go, kind of deeply into one country, one situation, to let people kind of see the depth of the problem, to go deeply into it and not be so superficial. And also Peru. So Peru kind of brought together a lot of the strands of the story, a lot of the problem over many generations, the acceleration of the looting industry in the 1980s and 90s, and also a lot of the solutions as well. A lot of the principles and the solutions that people were trying out to combat the looting and that feeds the illicit antiquities trade. And another point I'd say is that I hope I don't think people should be buying ancient artifacts. I said this at a collector's forum once, and I was speaking at a collector's forum. I think people were taken aback by that a bit, but I don't think anybody should be buying ancient artifacts of any kind, because you don't know if it's been looted. And if it is looted, then you're encouraging the looting of ancient sites. And I also think that if you're buying artifacts that are ancient, ancient could be anything, ancient Italian pots, ancient Greek sculpture, ancient Peruvian or Colombian, Guatemalan artifacts, you can be sure that it's either been looted or it's fake. And I don't think people should be buying those things. You don't know. The dealer might tell you that it came onto the market or, has been sitting in some established collection for many, many generations. That is dates from before 1970, from the time when international law started combating this problem. But you don't know that, and the dealer might not know that. And there's so many lies behind the international illicit antiquities trade that you really can't tell when things came out of the ground and how they came out of the ground. So by buying ancient artifacts, you really are encouraging the looting trade. So buy modern art, buy paintings, buy all kinds of things, but don't buy loot, but don't buy ancient artifacts.
Excellent points all around. We've been speaking tonight with professional journalist Roger Atwood. Roger, thank you so much for joining us here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you very much.
As always, an incredible conversation right there, Roger Atwood, and we'll have information about where to follow him online and his work right there at 7ages.org. Well, fellas, I've been looking around the Cross-Tyme Pub. Maybe it's about time for us to do some renovations. I see a little leaking over here, and in fact, I don't think there's anything on tap. I'm not sure what we've been drinking all night. Is this cold coffee? Are we doing cold brew in here now?
Maybe we're at that age.
Maybe the time has come.
Yeah.
I disagree.
Good. Okay. I was getting worried there just for a moment. I saw one of our listeners, Sherry Lynn Gleason, tweeting about us the other day. Actually, I see a lot of folks out there tweeting about every time a new episode of one of the various podcasts goes out. And of course, we always like to hear from you. So if anybody out there would like to reach us, you can always email us. The emails are there on the website, but you can always just use Micah, James, or Jason at 7ages.org. Drop us a line. Let us know what you like or what you don't like, what you'd like to hear more of. I've even gotten some interesting leads on some future potential guests recently. So, gentlemen, I'll give you a full update on that soon. But, whatever this is we've been enjoying tonight, cold brew or perhaps something else, I guess it's about time to pony up, have one more, and then hit the road, fellas. What do you say?
I say that sounds like a great idea.
Indeed. Well, as always, great to have both of you here with me. Great to have everyone out there listening, and follow us online, primarily at 7ages.org and via all of our social channels. Until next time, my friends, we'll continue to pursue mysteries of the ancient past, and we hope to see you all here when we do, right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.